realize I didn't start recording, to a wider community because it's really great to have more voices in the room, and you all are doing, similar kinds of work often. So I'm really excited to see some new faces and some old faces. So a couple of housekeeping things. This is a 1 hour training. We will really try to keep it to 1 hour. We hope that you can stay on mute for the presentation portion. And I know, as I do often, that you may have your video off because you are doing something else and you have this in the background, and I totally get that and respect that. But if you can, turn your video on, especially when we get to some discussion. That is so nice to see that there are real people there. And I think it's also, I'm trying to encourage myself when I can to try and focus on one thing as I have become more and more split focus over the years. So if you can join us in this space and really be here, that is so wonderful. Yay. Hello, people with your faces and your cameras. Yay. We have not been allowing AI bots to be in these trainings, but if you are using an AI note taker because you need help processing information, this recording will be sent out afterwards. So you will get another look at it. You can share it with people, with your partners and your colleagues. So this is not the only time you have access to this information. And you may have seen when you were registering that we asked a question, what do you want to see covered in this training? All of those responses were sent to Ava, and so she has done her best to try and integrate those questions into the presentation. So thank you for that info. That really helped design something that would be applicable to you. But as we go through the presentation, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I will collect those throughout. And then when we finish up Ava's presentation, we will, she's going to pose a prompt to us for some discussion, but we will also get some time to review. I will pose those questions to her, and you may also have some time to come off mute and ask questions. So feel free to be active in the chat. I'm watching it and I'm collecting things in there that you want to know. Okay, so with that, I'm really excited to welcome Ava Agudelo. Ava is a nonprofit leader. She has over 20 years of experience in food systems and community resiliency, and has helped to manage more than $8 million for local and national initiatives. Ava has also launched innovative programs like the National Incubator Farm Training Initiative, and she leads Full Bloom Futures, which helps organizations with visioning, project management, and importantly for today, fundraising. So yay, I'm so excited that you're here, Ava, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to get oriented with all my different screens and make sure I know what I'm looking at. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Everything Emma said is true. This is just a little bit of what I've done in the last 15, 20 years. It's interesting how we count our time in the nonprofit sector. My first job was actually running low-income housing programs for teenagers in Brattleboro, Vermont in 2002. So that was a long time ago. And yeah, I've been working in small to medium-sized nonprofits ever since, and have pretty much done all of the jobs that there are to do in organizations. But obviously, a lot of that has been around fundraising. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I definitely want to make sure folks know that everybody submitted all these questions, and they're so good and they're so rich. And I've tried to include a lot of that in here. But I think that the benefit of communities of practice is that you all have probably done some of these strategies yourself. And so while I'm presenting, if you want to think about anything you'd like to share around how any of these strategies have been successful for you, or your own tips and tricks, we're all experts here, and we're also all learners here. And so I think it's awesome to be able to share some of that. And I'm going to try and get through this so there's lots of time for folks to discuss. So here we are in 2025. What a world. I thought being a fundraising consultant was going to be a nice, relaxing job. And then January of 2025 happened and everything went insane. And it's been pretty wild. So obviously, the top concern and trend that people are experiencing right now is the loss of federal funds, which means there's a lot of competition for much smaller pots of funding. To some degree, some funders have stepped up to try and increase the size of their funding opportunities, but a lot of folks are seeing smaller gifts from foundations that they were receiving money from in the past. And it's really been seismic, the shifts around not only the amount of funding available, but the priorities, capacity, communications, the way we talk about our work and programs. There's obviously a lot of political divides. So mission clarity and alignment are a big deal and something that people are thinking about a lot. And there's a lot of economic uncertainty. So I think what everyone is really clear on is that in times of uncertainty, just like in an ecosystem, diversity is key because that's what makes us more resilient. And coming from that perspective, I think it's really important to understand that literally everything that you're doing to some degree can be thought of as fundraising. So doing a good job at something people need is the most essential core component of what makes you a viable candidate for funding from any entity, right? So that's everything that you're doing on the ground is representing you as competent, capable, trustworthy, exciting, interesting, impactful, effective. Like that's really the most important thing that you can do to raise funds for your organization is do a good job at something that matters. And then really building relationships, right? Every time you're engaging literally with anybody, related to your organization, stakeholders, anything like that, like the relationship is everything. And then, telling your story, like every time you're doing any work out in the field, you should really be thinking about how you're going to communicate the work that's happening, because to some degree, like the people who are benefiting and that's awesome. But if you didn't take a picture, or you didn't get a quote, or you didn't write it up, there's a whole world in which that activity didn't happen because there was no way to tell anybody that it happened. You need to be documenting your impact all of the time and really thinking about how money is a form of energy, and money and energy are a form of resources, right? So there are lots of kinds of resources that are not money. There are lots of ways that energy moves and flows throughout the food system, throughout nonprofit systems, that is not money, right? And start to sort of broaden your understanding around value and around how we, and like everybody has to pay the rent, everybody has to pay their bills, right? Money is money is money, and that's true and real. And also we all have access to resources and things that we can think about how we draw upon in more creative ways. So we're going to talk about that. So related to that, I do think it's really important that people make sure that they're understanding their resource flows. The other way you could think about this is like asset mapping. So when you're looking at the work that you're doing, I was just telling Emma about this. This is a project I'm working on in Boston where there's a lot of different stakeholders. They're moving a lot of different types of things around the system, right? There's food moving, there's storage and logistics, there's funding, there's data and feedback. So what are the resources in your system that are moving? Who's benefiting? Who's contributing? What is the actual value that you are providing? What is the thing that is getting provided to who? Where should you be providing support? And who should want to support you? Like, are there people who are benefiting from the work that you're doing and are not partnering with you in ways that they could be partnering with you, right? So just really understanding where the energy flows are in the work that you're doing and getting really clear for yourself on who is supporting you, who's being supported by you, what does that support look like, what's the value proposition, like that needs to be really clear for you and your organization in this moment, because that's what's going to help you build out the rest of your strategy moving forward. And then, of course, the key to this strategy, as I've already said, is diversify, diversify, diversify. So this is what makes us more resilient. And I think that people need to understand that, first of all, public funding is still a viable path. right? We're going to talk a little bit about municipal funds. We're going to talk about state funding and how those are things that people can still access. Geographically focused foundations are obviously something I think that's going to be really important for folks. National foundations, potentially, but I really think that going as local as possible to the scale where you have the deepest connection and deepest relationship and deepest impact is going to be a more effective strategy at this time than trying to go super big and broad, with some exceptions, which we'll talk about a little bit. Corporate giving. So people tend to think about this in terms of, like big corporations, national corporations, things like that. But there are other ways to think about corporate giving that can be more supportive and also mission aligned and values aligned with your organization. Individual giving, we got a lot of questions in advance about individual giving. So I have 3 whole slides about individual giving, and we'll talk about lots of different tools for that. Earned income is obviously something people want to consider and a really important part of your diversification strategy. And then collaborative fundraising opportunities, which is actually where some of those larger funding opportunities come in and some of those bigger, more national level funding streams. And then actually this photo is from a fundraiser that someone else ran for my organization. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience when someone calls you and is like, hi, I'm going to run a fundraiser for your organization and you don't have to do anything. We'll do all of the work and then we're just going to give you the money. Would you like to show up with a table? This was a pottery studio that did something called it was like a soup event. And so all their pottery students made bowls and then everyone made soup. And then they gave us $400 at the end of the night. And it was absolutely delightful. And we had a great time. And it was very time and cost effective. So there's opportunities like that too, that you may not know about that are out there that you can always try and foster. Okay. So before we get into the details and the sort of practical stuff, I want to talk about like kind of the big picture around fundraising, okay, and how it really works. And I think that this is more the case now than it has ever been. It was less the case with, as far as funding opportunities go. But now I think we're in a world where this is much more true. Accessing funds, it's 80% relationship, it's 20% asking. So almost all major gifts, most individual gifts, and honestly, a lot of grants come from consistent, steady stewardship. That's a lot of work. It takes time and effort, but it creates a sense of belonging. It creates meaning, and it is ultimately what helps people feel the impact of your work. And that's what motivates them to give. So you really have to think about how to build those relationships and how to make sure that you're connecting with people at that level and understanding that everybody you're connecting with, you have to think about in terms of those relationships and growing those relationships. This is one of the best pieces of advice on fundraising I ever got at the bottom here. If you want advice, ask for money. If you want money, ask for advice. What does that mean in practice? It means that oftentimes if you go to someone and say, hey, I'm looking for funding, and this can be a program officer at a foundation, this can be a potential major donor, it can even be a board member sometimes, and you say, we're really short on funds and we really need you to give a gift. They'll say, well, what you should probably consider doing is you should think about changing the program so that it works like this. And if you're struggling so much, maybe you're not managing your finances properly, and they will start giving you advice about how to fix the money problem. If you go to them and you say, hi, you're a very important part of our ecosystem as an organization, and I really want to hear what you have to say about where we're at as an organization. Can you share with us what you're thinking about where we are, about where we could be going, about our strengths, and really listen, authentically. And then at the end, you can say that those are all great ideas. We would love your support in funding them. Right? So that's an easier way to get into an ask. Okay, so this is my most woo-woo slide that I have in the whole presentation. So don't be scared. We'll get more practical down the line. But when I talk about building relationship, I am not asking anyone to be inauthentic. So I think some people can see fundraising and individual fundraising, particularly, or looking for grants or talking to people about fundraising as maybe kind of inauthentic, or it's like a little awkward, or it's strange, or it feels weird, or you don't want to feel like you're using people, like all these things, right? So the antidote to that is to seek resonance. So you find people that you resonate with, that get you. When you are being 100% authentic and you're sharing from your heart and you're explaining what you do from like the most pure place that you can come from, there are going to be people who don't get it. And they're going to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. This doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not into it. Great. Move on. You are also going to find people who go, oh my God, look at you. You're so lit up. You're so inspiring. What you're doing is so exciting. I'm thrilled. This sounds fabulous. Like, I like who you are. I like the way you talk about the work that you do. You find those people, and that's where you build your relationship. And that's where you dig in. And that counts not just for individuals, but for foundations, for program officers, for other organizations, for community partners. Find where you are most resonant and then express exactly what you want to express, genuine care and gratitude to people, right? Like, this is really about seeing the best in what people are offering you, and connecting authentically, both before you make an ask, during making that ask, and then after, right? You're stewarding and you're continuing that relationship, ideally because you want to. Ideally, because they're cool, interesting people who have a lot to offer you and your organization as well. They have useful feedback. They have connections. They have bigger picture ideas that they want to share with you, right? So you're cultivating joy and inspiration. That's really what you're trying to do about the work that you do. And the best way I can say this is, like, you want to be what matters about what you do. So if what you do is about generosity and ensuring that everyone has enough, be generosity in the way that you interact with your donors, your funders, everybody that could potentially be a supporter for your organization. Okay. All right, let's get practical. So I mentioned public funding. This is something a lot of folks are, they're like, federal funding's out the window. We don't have access to that anymore. Okay. So as terms of state level funding, municipal funding, one thing that you can do is think outside of your program focus. So maybe you have a state department or municipal department that works on food and food systems. Maybe they're doing nutrition education. Maybe it's extension, but there may be other entities and organizations and agencies that have some alignment with what you're doing. So you can think specifically about economic development, workforce, healthcare, public health. Many of you are probably partnering with those types of entities already, but if you're not, consider who else has opportunities that might be a good fit for you. Essentially, what agencies and departments have natural allies. And the best way to do that is if you already have connections or networks within the departments or the agencies that you've been working with, ask them if they know anybody, or if there's any sort of cross-agency work that's happening where you could get connected to someone in a different agency that might be able to give you an understanding of how you can access some of those municipal or state level funds. You want to get to know your lawmakers. So that means if you don't already have connections with your lawmakers, you're going to show up to events, hearings, shake hands, get cards. When I say get cards, not necessarily of your lawmaker, but definitely of their staff. Whoever is running those lawmakers' offices, that might not count for like state legislators, but certainly your federal delegation. You can offer your federal or state delegation or municipal folks site visits, program updates. And, first of all, it's great for them to know what you're doing. It raises your profile. And it can make it possible for you to have access to things like federal appropriations, and these sort of, I have it down at the bottom, but these sort of like special funding opportunities that come up sometimes, which we would think of as like discretionary. So maybe there's, a line item that didn't get spent last year and there's a little bit of extra money in that. And maybe there's an extra, few $1,000s that they can throw your way. Sometimes that's an even larger opportunity. You don't necessarily know, but there's a lot of money moving around even in this day and age. And if you build a relationship with those folks, you can find out what those opportunities are. And then make sure that you're doing advocacy with your sector and your allies for line items in budgets. So food policy councils, trade associations that might have more political heft than you do, but might be aligned. So for example, we did a lot of work with the restaurant associations in Rhode Island around food safety work, right? Because that was something that they were very invested in, and there was some sort of alignment around food donations and food recovery. And so we were able to work together, and that gave us a little bit of extra leverage. And then any entity that's doing advocacy work with nonprofits here in Rhode Island, it's the United Way, but that are providing general resources, like continue to show up to those things. You don't necessarily know where that's going to benefit you, but I think it's really important at this moment because it goes back to that idea of building relationships. Okay, local foundations. So this means community foundations, family foundations. Community foundations are often repositories of lesser known family funds that are not public. You can't find them on the internet. You don't necessarily know, but say, they give away $200,000 a year on, very, very specific things. Community foundation program officers will know what those pots are and what's available, and will sometimes be able to introduce you to funders or introduce you to folks who are looking for somewhere to give to, and they have a certain kind of priority. So get to know those program officers, invite them to your program, share with them your annual reports, ask them for advice. Again, hey, we've noticed everything's changing. What are you noticing? Can we take some time to talk about it? I have these questions, or we'd like to apply, and I'd like to know more about this opportunity. Really anything that you can do to start a dialogue going. Family foundations, again, it's really the same. Get to know your program officers. So maybe you're not ready to apply to something just yet, but you want to apply for it next year. Reach out and ask them if they would share some information with you, or if you could talk through what would make you a good candidate for the opportunity. And then you've built that rapport and they know to look out for your application. I think there was a time, and maybe it's still a little bit true, where you could just blind submit to a family foundation or to a smaller foundation without doing that pre-relationship building work and like a sort of cold application, and maybe you would be competitive. I think now that's less and less true because there's such an intensely huge volume of applicants going in that a lot of foundations are only funding previous grantees or people that they know or folks that they have a connection with. So I think it's really important to start to, if you don't already have those connections, build those connections. If you do already have those connections, please, please, please cultivate them. Make sure that you're reaching out, trying to get meetings or talk to folks, give them updates on where you're at. If you are in any kind of crisis, it's important to let your foundation funders know that. Some of them are giving more money because it's an emergency. And if that's an opportunity, you really want to be aware of that. Regionally focused grants can be opportunities for partnerships. Sometimes those are larger pots. I know folks did ask about how to partner with other organizations and have like sort of backbone funders and things like that. I wasn't really able to get into that in this presentation. That's actually kind of like a huge topic, which I am doing a lot of work around that right now. And I would love to talk to folks more about it if you want to reach out to me. It's just kind of outside of the scope, but I would say that it is a good idea to partner with other organizations because it does make you competitive for larger opportunities that you wouldn't have been otherwise. Healthcare. This is huge. This is kind of an example of like looking who in your community has resources right now and seeing what the pathway is to accessing those resources. So for a lot of hospitals, they have determination of need funding. If you're not already familiar with that, you should look into it. There's an expectation that these Companies will give back a certain amount of their profits for the benefit of the community, and that's mandated. And they can choose what they want to give to, but that's something that you might want to try to see how to access. It's not always open calls, but if you can build relationships again with the people who are doing the giving work or the social determinants of health work or whoever sort of overseeing that in your local area. And then insurers also, obviously, they have a lot of money, and they oftentimes have foundations or public benefit entities that you can reach out to. Okay. I am a fast talker. Thank you all so much for your patience. I hope that this is landing. And if anybody feels like they need me to slow down, maybe tell Emma in the comments and I'll do my best. Okay. So corporate giving, right? This is something that maybe gives some people the ick. They feel a little bit like, oh, we don't like doing that, right? But you can actually accomplish a lot through local corporate giving. So this breaks down to a few different categories. You can have national companies with a local presence. So for example, in Rhode Island, we have CVS is based here, and we have Hasbro is based here. So we have like other companies that do a lot of giving in the area, even though they're national. You would think about banks as well. There are certain local banks like credit unions that oftentimes have some kind of charitable giving. Technology companies that are locally located. Sometimes there are employee gift programs that you can get connected to. Those aren't generally like super lucrative, but they can be. Healthcare companies, again, and obviously food companies if you're doing food related work, and that's not just like a grocery store, but also maybe distributors or shipping companies or anything like that sometimes have charitable giving. Then there's businesses that are locally owned and mission aligned. So for example, in Rhode Island, where I started my organization, we have an entity called the Newport Restaurant Group. They own about 12 to 15 restaurants around the area, and they're super committed to buying local. And, they're a worker-owned cooperative, and they reached out and were like huge supporter. And they did like an annual giving campaign where they gave a portion of all the gift cards that were purchased during the holiday season to 3 different community organizations. And that was like $9,000 a year usually. So things like that can really add up and be super helpful. And those are folks like I had no qualms whatsoever about partnering with a worker-owned, locally focused restaurant group company. Like that was awesome, right? So you probably have companies in your neighborhood, in your area, again, that are mission aligned. Make sure it's a fit and then really go all in on that if you can. You really need to think about what you have to offer a company. Primarily, that's going to be visibility. So that's volunteer exposure, newsletters, and events. And think about who your stakeholders are, like who already has your eye, and will they support local business, and how can you make the case to them to support these local businesses? So is it like a banner at an event? Is it your newsletter has a blurb about them? Are they coming out to volunteer in your program? Like all those things sort of cultivate that relationship. Sponsorships versus grants. So companies will do a lot of times both of these. Sponsorships are usually for events and they're usually smaller amounts of money. And then sometimes the company has a charitable foundation, which will usually be a larger grant or more money and opportunity. For example, I'm working with a client in upstate New York right now, and Blue Cross Blue Shield has sponsored their events for the last 3 years, and also, which was, a $3,000 to $5,000 gift. And then they also have a charitable giving foundation, which you can apply to for grants, which is like a $50,000 opportunity. Okay. Earned income. Again, this is like thinking about what your value proposition is. What do you have that other people need? So that's experience, expertise, labor, resources. Think about like your building. If you have a building, can you rent out your conference room? If you have vehicles that are not on the road, Can you offer up services for trucking? So you want to do that asset mapping that I was talking about earlier and really figure out like what do you have that is of value to others? Who is your customer, right? It's not necessarily going to be a traditional customer, but like, are there other organizations that could benefit from your value proposition? Municipalities, companies, volunteers, contracts are often fee for service. It's not necessarily a grant, but it is an opportunity to do what you do in a way that benefits another entity. What resources do they have? Sometimes it's money, and that's great. Sometimes it's other things. Maybe they have a truck. Maybe they have a conference room that you can use. So if those were things that you were spending money on and you can't afford to do that anymore, is there someone else in the community that has access to those resources that you could take advantage of? So really starting to think beyond just money as we map assets for our organizations. And then again, collaborative fundraising is a great opportunity. You can think about that in terms of services. You could be a sub-awardee on other grants. You can provide technical infrastructure, technical assistance, shared infrastructure, and then again, shared resources. And that's things and people. Maybe you have a staff member that could be supportive for another organization. How could you share their expertise if they're not being fully utilized or what have you? Okay. So individual giving. This is what a lot of people wanted to talk about. So large donors, first of all, you don't know necessarily who could be a large donor. There may be someone who has given you $50 who could give you $5,000. Just because they are a small donor doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be a small donor. It doesn't mean that they can give you more. You don't know. So what you need to do is know those donors and do as much research as you can, because you want to be able to identify how much they are capable of giving. So you are asking them for the appropriate sized gift. You can do that in a lot of different ways. You can look at property records. You can see if they've given gifts to other organizations. You can ask people who are like in the know, sort of talk to more folks in your community, talk to other nonprofit leaders if they're willing to share that information. And then you're going to be building relationships, right? So you're staying connected. You're asking for their connections as well. If they become a champion of your organization, you want to ask if they know anybody else who would be interested in giving. And then you want to hang out. You want to have coffee dates. You want to go on walks. You want to do program-specific activities. So that is a way that you're cultivating that relationship. And again, you're asking for advice and then you're asking for money. So you want to hear their perspective and their opinion. And honestly, like you do, right? You want to hear what people are thinking and saying and feeling about your organization. Doesn't mean you have to take everybody's advice, but I do think it's valuable to get that feedback. As far as grassroots giving and new donors, folks had said, how do we start from scratch? How do we get more people into the mix? Okay. So if you want new audiences, there's a few different ways to go about that. You can try to get press, right? So that raises the visibility. You can try and get an article in a magazine, a newspaper, a radio story, something that's getting your program out to a wider audience. Social media, obviously. Word of mouth ultimately is the most effective when people are telling their friends and each other about your organization. That's going to be where people trust the value proposition the most, is when they're hearing it from someone they already trust. And then small events. So things like a house party, right? Let's say you have a donor that's a big fan of yours and they say, okay, I'm going to have a little potluck and I'm going to invite 10 of my friends and I'd like you to come and we'll all eat and we'll have a nice time and we'll hang out. And then at the end or in the middle or wherever, if you could talk about your organization just for 10 minutes and ask anybody if they're interested in giving or if they want to follow up with you, that you're available. That's how you start to build those relationships and make those personal connections. And ideally, your donor, whoever's offering to have that event for you, is also kind of sponsoring it. So maybe they're paying for the food, they're providing the location, they're managing the invite. So that takes some of the burden off of you. And that's something that your board members could do. And that's a way to sort of like bring new folks into the fold. when you do any of these things, you have to be ready to engage them and make an ask. So you can get people excited about what you're doing. And then maybe they like go to your website and they read your website, and then nowhere there does it say, hey, come to this event, or give here, or become a donor, or here's how you can get involved, right? They're going to read about your thing. They're going to be like, oh, that's cool. And then they're going to click away and maybe never come back. Right. And they may have been aligned. So you have to have something to like engage them. If you catch their attention, what do you do with it? Right. And all the things that I mentioned, having an event, having a fundraising ask, sign up for a newsletter. There has to be something there for them to like do. Peer fundraising, again, word of mouth, like I was talking about the events, but I really think that peer fundraising is super, super important. And if you can engage anybody who you know who's a fan of your organization in talking to their friends about giving, I think that's really key. And then you want to return to your value proposition consistently. So you really want to be thinking about who you're talking to and what is the value that they're offering them, and what value are they going to see in what you're doing, and just be really consistent in that messaging. As I said about events, please, small targeted events only, no galas, no concerts, no like huge thingies. If you're not already doing that, they're incredibly time intensive. They're incredibly staff intensive. It takes a huge amount of your energy and resources, and they're not really actually always that lucrative. Unless, again, you have like a long standing community history of running that event and it's been very successful in the past. So things like house parties, program specific events, farm walks, volunteer days, talks. You can do like a book discussion or something like that, that is easy to organize, resource light on you, and creates more of that one-on-one connection anyway, which is actually really what you want. Okay, more on individual giving. Okay, board. How do you get your board engaged? Your board is a giving board. All boards are giving boards. There is no such thing as a board that does not have to give or be engaged in fundraising. Maybe they are also a governing board. Maybe they are also supporting the organization in some other way, or they're a startup board or whatever. They can be all of those things. And in this day and age, with what's going on these days, all boards must be giving boards. Okay. They should be making connections. They should be making asks. You should be investing in development training for your board if they don't have it, if they're uncomfortable with that, if they don't know how to do those things. There are a gazillion resources out there for boards on fundraising that are free. And you can also have someone do a small training with your board, explain to them how to do this, work together with them, do it in a way they feel comfortable and they're okay with it. But it's really should not be an option for your board to not be doing fundraising with you at this point. You want to keep them informed and activated in the same way you're keeping your donors activated. You want to make sure that they have opportunities to be doing this. And I think it's important to effectively communicate the seriousness of the situation. If the people on your board are not familiar with the federal funding climate, it's not something they're used to engaging with. They do need to understand that this is a unique moment, and that the strategies that you've been using historically may not be as effective. And they need to you need to present that in a way that they really get the gravity of the situation. Okay, stewardship and retention. People asked about technology and systems. So from my perspective, if you are a small organization or a medium-sized organization, or you're resource constrained in any way, you cannot afford to skimp on your systems. You must invest in those, because if you do not, you are wasting your time on administration that is inefficient and is going to bite you down the line, right? So if you don't have systems, you really should be investing in them. And I don't mean like you have to go out and buy some expensive software. I mean, you need to think about what your process is for stewarding donors, and you need to make sure everyone's trained to do that. And you have to have that defined and also happening consistently. You can use things like Airtable, spreadsheets that are, super cost effective, the Google Suite. Little green light, I've heard great things about for donor management. But anything you use, you want to be able to track changes over time for each donor, plus details. Okay. So you can have a spreadsheet that gives you a list of gifts that happened this year, but you need to be able to see if that donor also gave last year and also gave the year before, and if they gave more or less, so that you can target your asks, so you can understand what you should be requesting from them. And you must follow up, and you must follow up quickly. So you want to have a system where that's happening, where you're sending thank you notes. Every gift that you receive is a test of how you steward your donors. So maybe somebody who could give you a $10,000 gift is giving you a $50 gift to see what your infrastructural capacity is and how you manage that. And if they don't get a thank you note and they don't get any follow-up, they're not going to take your organization seriously, and they're not going to consider giving you larger gifts. So you really need to think about, anytime you get a gift, how are you thanking that person? How are you retaining that information? And how are you following up? You want to think in annual terms. So annual campaigns are great. They happen once a year, but at minimum, your donors should have quarterly opportunities to engage in some way or another. You can be making different types of quarterly asks. So for example, there's a statewide day of giving, maybe, that happens in the spring. And then in the summer, you have a solstice campaign. And then in the fall, you start building up to your annual campaign. And then in the winter, it's like end of year. And then the rule of thumb, whenever you are communicating with individual donors and stewarding them, is you want to be offering something to them 60% of the time that you reach out to them. A recipe, a story, an inspiring moment, a piece of data, some way that they can take action, something cool that's going on in the community. And then 40% of the time you can be making an ask. But you don't want to only be reaching out to people when you have something to ask from them. You also want to be offering. All right, we are... we don't have to get into this, but I think a lot of people struggle with making that ask. So these are a couple little scripts that I wanted to share with folks, and this will be in the slideshow if you are struggling with that. People give because they are asked. You have to ask. That is a hard thing to do, to go from talking about your program, which is probably easy to do, to asking people for money, which might feel a little bit harder and stranger, right? So this script helps you kind of get over that lump and go from talking about what you're doing to asking. And I want you to just think for a minute, when you get asked by an organization that you love and support and is doing really cool work, and when they ask you for money, do you feel like, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like you're being bothered? Do you feel like you're being harassed or insulted or anything like that? I usually either feel flattered or neutral. I want to support the organizations that I believe in. So a lot of times people think they're bugging people by asking them for money, but that's not how they actually experience it. Some people may, and that's okay. And you'll find out who those people are, and then you maybe won't interact with them as much, and that's also okay. But people are generally flattered to be asked, and it does get easier the more that you do it and the more that you practice that. And yeah, sometimes you might feel a little bit annoyed by an ask, for sure. But I think it's very rare that people are like mad or like don't get that nonprofits need money. And even if you ask for like a little more than people would think of as like a gift, sometimes they're flattered. They're like, oh, you think I can give you $2,000? Like, you must think that I have all the monies. Or, you know, so it isn't always going to land the way that maybe you're afraid that it's going to land, and it is worth taking that risk. Okay, so storytelling and impact, you must track your data. This is never optional. You need your quantitative data and your qualitative data, always, always, always. Photos, that means you need to train your staff to always be taking pictures. Quotes, you can be doing surveys or one-on-ones, but please remember to capture those quotes. And you want to be thinking about your value proposition and segmenting your audience and who wants to hear what about your program. Some folks are concerned about ethics and data collection. So these are some just standard rules for how to do that in a way that is not harmful. So minimize the burden on whoever you're asking for data. absolutely under no circumstances should they be worse off afterwards than they were before. So do no harm. Only for tangible benefit. So if you know how they're going to benefit from the sharing of that data, then that adds to the validity of the request. You can always pay people for their time. That is a great thing to do and important and valid and a way to make sure that you're not exploiting people. You can offer anonymity and you should be getting explicit consent to share any of this. So you should just ask people, say, are you comfortable with me sharing this? And if you have not asked and you did not get that consent, probably you shouldn't use it. And then I think if you just hold to the principle of respecting the inherent worth and dignity of every person, you're going to go pretty far that way. So just because someone's in a position of need doesn't mean that they aren't worthy of respect and dignity. Everybody in this room absolutely should know that at this point. But if you always bring that energy to when you're doing data collection, I think you'll go pretty far with that. This is just a couple great resources about storytelling and impact. The Urban Institute has amazing stuff. And then this website, Framing Fundamentals, and how we think about how we frame our work. You really want to know your audience. You want to use the funders' words. If they're using particular words, you should be using those words as well. You may think that it is the same, but it is not. If they say environmental impact, you should be using the word environmental impact. If they say community benefit, and that's not something you usually do, but you are providing community benefit, please use the words community benefit, right? Again, ask your audience what they care about, give them that, keep it short, impactful, and visually appealing. Again, going back to photos and quotes, so important. Everyone loves them. And if you can, please invest in graphic design support when possible. It's really going to make a difference. So this is just an example of an impact report that I created that has all those different components. We have quantitative, we have qualitative, we have photos of the work, we have dollar values of things, we have other support that we've received. People really like giving money to people who have already have money. Super annoying, but super true. So if you can show that other people have invested in you, they will be more likely to invest in you as well. And again, a volunteer quote, another organization's quote, a farmer quote, whoever your core stakeholders are, make sure you're talking about what value you've offered them. Beyond dollars, volunteers, you want to be realistic about what they can do. You want to invest in their training and provide value and make sure you're quantifying theirs. So volunteer time is set at a federal rate, and you should absolutely be, I'm not your accountant, and that is different for accounting, but it is a value and you can think about it that way, and you probably should. And you will need to cultivate and steward your volunteers for them to really be supportive and effective. And then the last thing is resources and technology. I think investing in these things is a good idea. I think it is an upfront cost, but it is a huge time saver. And again, if you don't have a lot of staff or resources, this can really help you out if you know how to use them and set them up properly. Lots of ways to automate tasks, Zapier, Asana, calendars. Really, this is how you can be efficient, right? This is also a resource, is your time, and this can make your time more effective. AI tools, you get what you put in. These are a couple tools that I particularly like. ChatGPT is good for research. I really like Claude for writing. You give it a prompt. You really want to structure your prompt very specifically. These are the ways that I think it's best to do that. And then, of course, you have to review, revise, and spot check, but it can be a really big time saver. And then finally, relationships are everything, right? So going back to this, I think that if you look back at some of those more practical things, you can see that throughout, it's really about stewarding those relationships, seeking resonance, expressing gratitude, all of those tools, everything of that you use, you have to be infusing it with this, right? Because this is actually what's going to get that support to you. That went for a long time, and now we only have 8 minutes. I'm sorry, but hopefully that felt useful, and I'm excited to talk more and hear from you guys.
Thank you. Ew, that was incredible. What a feat to cover that much. No, truly, that was really, I think that was wonderful. Yeah, Katie, yes, this is so helpful. I'm wondering, Ava, can you stay on like 5 or 10 minutes past the
Oh
hour?
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah,
maybe what
totally.
we can do is I have one question from the chat that I'd love to pose to you. Maybe I'll do my little closeout, and then if there's people who have questions that are outstanding, they want to stay, Ava and I could stay on for 10 minutes past the hour, and you can stay with us to ask those questions. Does that sound all right? Okay. Great. So there was one question that Andy posed that then was seconded, which I think is a really great one. So you were talking about um, having small events, at somebody's house, and that would be a great way to cultivate individual donors. And we have a lot of organizations that are working on a national level, right? Or they're doing a lot of virtual work. So what is a way for them to do that kind of cultivation, but maybe it's, more virtual and less in person?
That's a really good idea. And I do think that that's a lot harder. And I think we've become accustomed to like not having as many in-person events. I mean, I think historically, right, like conferences have been the opportunity to do that. Or if you're traveling and you can get in the same vicinity as those folks for other reasons, or, there's a way that you can like get there really in person is just always so much better. But I think if you are doing virtual, I would recommend trying like a phone call. And that might be like a generational thing, but I feel like there's something that's a little bit different qualitatively about engaging with somebody like you're talking to a buddy on the phone versus this sort of like business like Zoom thing that we do, which like can be nice, right? Because they can see you being expressive and they can see your face and whatever. But I think once you've already made that connection, like I have a funder that I don't even have a program anymore. And we still have like, we talk to each other on the phone every like 6 months because we just love each other. And it's nice. And we don't necessarily do a Zoom because it's nice to just chat, right? Um, so that's one thing. I guess, yeah, I think if you can manage to travel to an area where those folks are there, really do try to do the thing in person. And if you have local connections, maybe they can set up that event for you, or you can have like a dinner or coffee. Or like if there's a reason for both of you to be going to a place, can you like find something to share about that's in that place that like represents the work that you're doing? If you are doing national level work, like connecting them to a partner, providing again, like what can you give, right? What can you provide? Because people actually don't give or donate without getting something. And it's a feeling a lot of the time. It's an experience. It's an identity of being of value, useful, important, connected, right? Like, what is it that motivates folks? And see if you can offer that.
Hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I love a phone call. I do a lot of calling when I talk to grantees, and I do find that the return is often better when you actually just talk to somebody on the phone. I want to just drop in the chat because I think there was a piece at the end here about storytelling, and that's a really big topic in itself. And so, if you want to explore that more, and partly as it relates to funding and how to tell a story for a funder, I recommend people try and come to the training that we're doing next week with Jerusha Klemperer. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat if you want to register to that, because I think that's a big topic and you touched on it here, but it's a lot to talk about how you can really share the story to be able to build those relationships. Oh, thank you so much. If you're going to head out now, really appreciate you. And if you have questions, you feel free to come off mute and ask them.